On Christmas Eve, an overworked single mom named Lena Morales offered steady, gentle service to a grey-haired man in a flawless suit, letting him sit a little longer, warming his coffee twice, shielding his silence from the manager's impatient looks, never knowing he was actually a billionaire, testing who still had a heart, and that this ordinary kindness would soon place her and her child on the edge of a life-changing decision. The small roadside diner buzzed with low chatter and clinking forks, while tired Christmas lights blinked in the windows and pine garlands sagged above the booths like decorations that had worked too many seasons. Outside, the winter dark pressed against the glass, but inside, everything tried to feel safe. Warm vinyl seats, sugary carols, the smell of fried food and cinnamon that pretended hardship could be softened. Lena told herself it would be just another long shift until the man rose without a word, buttoned his coat with perfect calm, and left his receipt behind like a final silent statement. What Lena did next wasn't about money, and it wasn't about pride the way people imagine it. No scene, no pleading, no anger served on a tray. It was about dignity, the quiet kind that lives in people who say yes sir all day and still refuse to believe they are worthless. She lifted the receipt and saw it in plain ink, tip, 0, and the humiliation landed with the precision of a message meant to sting, yet she kept her face gentle for her son's sake, because some forms of strength don't make noise when they stand. Her toddler's warm weight shifted against her shoulder, a soft whimper in his sleep, reminding her of the pharmacy bottle at home, and the last doses counted like prayers. Lena slid the plate toward herself to clear the table, moving on instinct, wipe, stack, breathe, keep going, until the porcelain scraped lightly and something thin caught beneath it. A folded note slipped free and landed near her fingers, pressed flat, as if it had been placed with intention, and for a moment the diner's cheerful sounds felt far away, like music heard through a closed door. She opened it slowly, the paper crisp and stubborn, and there was no cash tucked inside, only a time, an address, and a single sentence written with calm authority. Come alone, trust no one. Lena's pulse jumped, not with simple hope, but with the warning sense that hope sometimes arrives wearing danger, and as the Christmas lights kept blinking above her like indifferent stars, she understood that the man who left 0 had not finished speaking. He had simply changed the language. The note sat in Lena's palm, like a coal that refused to cool, small, plain, and somehow louder than the diner's laughter. She kept her face composed, because her son was still curled against her shoulder, heavy with sleep and fever, and a mother learns to swallow panic the way she swallows fatigue. Around her, forks kept moving and carols kept playing, but the sound felt distant now, as if a glass wall had slid down between her and everyone else. She could still see the receipt in her mind, tip, $0, like a stamp on her worth, and she hated that it had landed exactly where she was most tender. The humiliation wasn't only public, it was personal, because it touched the fear she never said out loud. For a moment she didn't open the paper again. She just held it, letting the crisp fold press into her thumb, anchoring her to something solid. The Christmas lights blinked in the window with stubborn cheer, and the smell of cinnamon and frying oil hung in the air, like a promise the world couldn't keep. Lena shifted her son. Noah's cheek was too warm, his little breath catching in a faint wheeze that made her chest tighten, and she forced herself to keep moving, because stopping meant falling apart. Her co-worker Tessa passed by with a tray and slowed when she saw Lena's eyes, soft concern flickering before she masked it with a practiced smile. "You okay?" Tessa murmured, and Lena answered the way struggling people always do. "I'm fine," even though the lie tasted like metal. The silence inside Lena grew heavier, not empty but crowded with rent notices, pharmacy receipts, and the memory of Noah's cough at 2 in the morning. She tucked the note into her apron like it might burn through the fabric, then wiped the table again, as if cleanliness could erase what had happened there. But the more she tried to return to routine, the more her body refused to agree. Her hands shook slightly, her throat tightened, and her heartbeat kept knocking like someone trapped behind a door. She glanced once toward the windows, half expecting to see the billionaire's car idling outside, half praying she wouldn't. It was the strangest kind of fear, being noticed by power after a lifetime of being overlooked. When the rush eased, Lena stepped into the narrow space near the coffee station, where the light was dimmer and the noise softened, just enough to think without being swallowed by her own thoughts. She drew the note back out and unfolded it again, slower this time, as if speed might make the words sharper. The sentence stared up at her, "Come alone, trust no one," and beneath it, in smaller handwriting she hadn't registered before, a time and place waited like a trap laid with courtesy. 11:45 p.m., Hawthorne Hotel, service entrance. Her breath caught, and she felt that strange tilt inside her, the part of her that wanted to crumple the paper and choose safety, and the part that knew safety had stopped visiting her life a long time ago. The diner's warmth suddenly felt thin, like a blanket that didn't reach her feet. She looked down at Noah, at the soft fall of his eyelashes, and the way his fingers still clung to her shirt, even in sleep, like he already understood that the world could slip away if he let go. Lena's mind tried to run ahead, hotel doors, security guards, polished floors that would judge her shoes. But her heart stayed locked on one truth. Her child needed help, and the calendar didn't care that it was Christmas. She folded the note carefully, not with hope exactly, but with the precision of someone handling something dangerous and valuable at the same time. Then she slipped it deep into her pocket and returned to the floor with a steady face, because the world always demanded she perform calm while she bled quietly inside. And somewhere in the winter dark beyond the diner windows, the Hawthorne Hotel waited, like a bright doorway that could be salvation or the beginning of a different kind of loss. By the time Lena finally stepped out into the parking lot, the diner's warmth felt like it belonged to someone else. Her breath turned white the moment it left her lips, and the night air bit at her cheeks as if winter wanted payment too. Noah shifted against her shoulder, half asleep and restless, and she tightened her hold the way she always did when fear tried to take up space in her chest. The note stayed hidden in her pocket, but it didn't feel hidden at all. It felt like it had moved inside her, pressing against every thought, making ordinary things look fragile. She started the car with a quiet prayer she didn't fully believe in anymore, then drove home beneath streetlights that blinked like tired eyes, telling herself she would not let a stranger's cruelty or a stranger's offer steer her life. And yet with every mile, the words returned, "Come alone, trust no one," like the kind of warning that also dares you to disobey it. At home, the apartment greeted her with that familiar mix of smallness and stubbornness, thin walls, second-hand furniture, and a little Christmas tree by the window that looked brave for standing at all. Lena laid Noah down as gently as if he were made of glass, brushed his damp hair off his forehead, and listened until his breathing steadied into a softer rhythm. The medicine bottle on the counter was almost empty, and the sight of it made her stomach twist in that quiet, humiliating way that never needed an audience to hurt. She turned on the lamp near the sink, and the yellow light fell across unpaid envelopes like it had done too many nights before. There had been a time when this place felt temporary, when she believed she was only passing through hardship on her way back to something brighter. Now, hardship felt like the address itself. In the stillness, the past came back the way it always did, without permission, without mercy, and yet with a sweetness that made the ache worse. She remembered another Christmas Eve years ago, when Noah was only a baby and the tree was smaller, and her husband, Eli, had taped a paper star to the top because they couldn't afford a real one, laughing like it was a joke the world couldn't steal. Eli had been the kind of man who said, "We'll be okay," and somehow made it sound believable, even when their bank account said otherwise, even when life pushed and pushed to see if love would bend. He worked too hard, smiled too often, and carried his pride quietly, until one winter the phone call came and the temporary turned permanent in a single breath. Lena had learned to survive after that, but surviving wasn't the same as living, and tonight the note in her pocket felt like someone had offered her a door back to air. She sat at the tiny kitchen table and unfolded the note again, reading the address as if staring long enough might reveal whether it was blessing or trap. The Hawthorne Hotel, service entrance, 11:45 p.m. And then that line, calm as a command, "Come alone, trust no one." Lena let the words settle, and she tried to imagine walking into a place like that with the smell of diner grease still clinging to her hair. Tried to imagine being seen by people who looked through women like her as if they were smudges on glass. She thought of the billionaire's face, how he never flinched, how his silence felt intentional, how the $0 tip had been placed like a stamp, not an accident. Part of her wanted to tear the paper into tiny pieces and choose the safety of predictable suffering, but another part, the mother part, kept whispering that predictable suffering was still suffering, and Noah's fever didn't care how proud she was. That was when her eyes fell on the old drawer by the counter, the one she rarely opened because it held the leftovers of a life she didn't know how to revisit. Lena pulled it open, meaning only to find the thermometer, but her fingers brushed something stiff beneath a stack of faded documents, a worn envelope with Eli's handwriting on the front, sealed and forgotten. Her heart gave a sudden, sharp beat as she slid it out, because the ink looked newer than it should have, as if it had been waiting for the right night to be read. She opened it with trembling hands, unfolded the single page inside, and felt the room tilt when she saw the first line. "Lena, if anything ever happens to me and you hear the name Hawthorne, you have to be careful." She stared at the word, Hawthorne, then at the note from the diner, and the air seemed to drain out of the apartment as she realized this wasn't a stranger's game at all. It was a thread tied to her long before tonight. Lena didn't sleep. She only sat beside Noah's bed and listened to the small, uneven music of his breathing, letting every wheeze count down the minutes. Eli's old letter lay open on the kitchen table like a ghost with handwriting, and the word Hawthorne seemed to glow in the cheap lamplight, accusing her for not seeing it sooner. She wanted to be angry at him for keeping secrets, but the anger wouldn't stick. Fear kept washing it away, because fear was practical and anger was a luxury. When the clock crawled toward midnight, Lena kissed Noah's warm forehead and whispered that she would be back soon, even though her voice didn't fully believe itself. Then she did the hardest thing a careful mother ever does. She stepped out into the night alone, carrying only a folded note and the weight of her child's need. The Hawthorne Hotel rose out of the winter dark like a polished promise. Tall windows, soft gold light, and a quiet that felt expensive enough to keep people like her outside. Lena didn't go through the front doors. She followed the instructions. Service entrance, walking past stacked linens and humming machines, guided by a security guard who barely looked at her, but somehow seemed to know she was expected. The air inside smelled like polished wood and citrus cleaner, and her diner shoes sounded too loud on the spotless floor, each step announcing that she did not belong. She kept her shoulders square anyway. Dignity was the only coat she owned that never wore out. When the guards stopped at a private corridor and nodded without a word, Lena felt her pulse climb, not because she wanted adventure, but because she recognized the shape of a trap. Silence, authority, and doors that close behind you. A woman in a fitted black suit met her there, An assistant, perhaps, her smile professional and empty, her eyes sharp enough to measure weakness. "Ms. Morales," she said, as if Lena's name had been rehearsed, as if it had existed in this building long before Lena ever did. She took Lena's coat gently, then offered her a glass of water, with the calm choreography of someone trained to make fear look like hospitality. "You're here on time," the woman added, and there was something in that phrase, approval or warning. Lena couldn't tell which. The corridor was too quiet, and Lena suddenly remembered the note's command, "Trust no one." So she held her questions in her mouth, the way you hold a hot drink, careful not to spill. When the assistant opened a door at the end of the hall, warm light spilled out, and Lena stepped into a room that felt like a different planet. He was waiting at a small table, not the grand kind meant for speeches, but a neat private setting that made the moment feel intimate, and therefore more dangerous. The billionaire looked exactly as he had in the diner, only sharper here, as if the cheap booth had been a disguise, and this polished room was his true skin. His grey hair was combed back with meticulous care, his suit perfect, his face calm in a way that suggested he had never needed to rush for anything in his life. He gestured to the chair across from him, and the gesture wasn't kind. It was precise, like a judge allowing someone to speak. Lena sat without asking permission twice, because she refused to be smaller than her own truth. And when she placed the folded note on the table, she watched his eyes flick to it, then back to her, as if he were reading her more than the paper. "You were humiliated tonight," he said at last, not apologizing, not softening it, simply naming it like a fact he had purchased. Lena's throat tightened, but her voice came out steady. She told him about Noah's fever, the medicine running low, the rent notice like a knife on the counter, and she did it without begging, because begging turns a person into a performance. The billionaire listened with that same controlled silence, then asked questions that didn't sound like help at all. Questions about honesty when no one is watching, about what a mother will do when the world offers her a shortcut, about whether kindness is still possible when kindness has never paid her back. Lena felt the room trying to turn her life into a test, and something in her stiffened, not pride, not anger, something older, like self-respect returning to its feet. "I'm not here to be played with," she said quietly, and the billionaire's gaze sharpened, as if he had been waiting for that sentence more than any other. Then he slid a thin folder across the table, clean white paper, a pen placed beside it like a final invitation, and in a voice as calm as snowfall, he offered her a chance that sounded less like a job and more like a door you only walk through once, leaving Lena to wonder whether the real danger was the offer, or what would happen if she refused it. The folder felt lighter than it should have, like it was made of paper and consequences instead of ink and signatures, and Lena hated how the billionaire's calm made the whole thing seem reasonable. He didn't offer her a paycheck on the spot, didn't say the words she needed most, medicine, rent, safety. He only pointed to the pen, as if her desperation were a simple administrative detail. On the first page, the language was clean and confident, the kind written by people who never have to read it twice to understand what it costs: confidentiality, compliance, silence. Lena's fingers hovered, and she heard her own heartbeat, louder than the hotel's quiet, because she could feel the trap taking shape. If she signed, she belonged to this world. If she didn't, she went back to the cold with an empty bottle and a child who couldn't wait for pride. The billionaire watched her without blinking, as if hesitation itself were the point of the exercise. When she finally spoke, her voice stayed low and steady, the way it did at the diner when customers got loud and she had to keep her dignity intact. She asked what the chance actually was, what she would do, who she would answer to, what she would be asked to carry home in her pockets besides fear. He answered with careful vagueness, words like integrity, discretion, proof, as if goodness were a commodity that needed auditing. Then he offered the first task as though it were nothing. Deliver a sealed envelope to a person he named, at a location he named, and do it tonight. No questions, no detours, no conversations. Lena stared at the envelope when it was placed in front of her, wax-stamped and perfectly scented, and something in her stomach tightened because she'd carried takeout boxes and coffee refills her whole life. But this felt like carrying someone else's weapon. She thought of Eli's letter, "Be careful," and she wondered if careful was still possible once you were already inside the room. The billionaire didn't raise his voice, didn't threaten her outright. He didn't have to. He simply described what help could look like if she proved she was trustworthy, and the word trustworthy landed like a chain wrapped in velvet. He mentioned a private clinic partnership in passing, like a man referencing the weather, and Lena felt a wave of anger so sharp it almost made her dizzy. How could someone speak about a child's breathing like it was a bargaining chip? Yet behind the anger, there was that other truth, the one she was ashamed to admit. She needed this, because Noah needed it. And need makes even good people negotiate with their fear. Lena told herself she could do one delivery, one careful step, one moment of obedience in exchange for medicine, and then walk away with her soul intact. The billionaire's eyes softened by a fraction, not into kindness, but into satisfaction, as if he had just watched a lock click into place. She left the Hawthorne through the same quiet corridor, the assistant's smile returning like a mask that never got tired, and the envelope tucked deep in her bag, as if hiding it could make it safer. The city felt colder on the ride home, the streetlights harsher, every red light long enough for her mind to spiral. What was inside the envelope? Who would receive it? What did it buy? What did it ruin? At the apartment, Noah was still asleep, cheeks flushed, and Lena stood over him for a moment with the envelope against her ribs, because it felt wrong to carry secrets into the room where her child breathed. She didn't wake him. She couldn't. She only counted his breaths and promised herself she was doing this for him, not for the thrill of a door opening into wealth. Then she wrote a note for the neighbor who sometimes listened for Noah's cries, a simple line asking them to keep an ear out, just in case, and she hated that the world had trained her to prepare for disaster as naturally as making coffee. Before she left again, she checked her phone out of habit and saw something that made her throat go dry, a missed call from the diner, followed by a text from her manager. "We need to talk about the rumors. Come in early tomorrow." Lena stared at the message and felt the first real bruise of the billionaire's world forming on her life, soft at first, then spreading. When she looked down at the envelope again, she noticed a second name printed faintly beneath the seal, almost hidden in the paper's design, as if it wasn't meant for her eyes at all. It wasn't the billionaire's name, and it wasn't anyone she knew. Yet the letters carried the weight of someone powerful enough to hurt her without ever stepping into the diner. Lena slipped the envelope back into her bag, locked the apartment door behind her, and walked into the night, with a single thought tightening around her heart. She had agreed to a test, but she couldn't tell any more who was being tested and who was being hunted. Lena delivered the envelope the way she'd been instructed, quietly, quickly, and without asking a single question out loud, yet every step felt like a question in her bones. The address led her to a side entrance of a building that didn't advertise itself, the kind of place where the lobby smells like stone and silence, and the security cameras look like polished eyes. A man in a dark coat took the envelope without surprise, as if this handoff had been scheduled weeks ago, and his fingers didn't even brush hers. No warmth, no acknowledgement, only procedure. Lena walked back to her car with the strange feeling that she had just moved a chess piece for someone who would never learn her name, and she didn't know whether to feel relieved or contaminated. By the time she turned the key in the ignition, her pride had risen like a shield, because if she let fear show, it would swallow her whole. The next morning, the diner looked the same. Same blinking lights, same tired booths, but Lena felt different inside it, as if she'd brought a shadow back with her. Her manager pulled her aside near the coffee station, voice low, eyes darting toward customers like gossip might have ears. He asked where she'd been last night, why people were saying her name alongside a hotel like the Hawthorne, why a fancy man had been asking questions. Lena kept her face calm and answered with the simplest truth she could afford. She had been working, she had gone home, she had nothing to confess. Yet she could feel how easily the world builds a story around a woman who doesn't have money to defend herself. When he cut her weekend shifts until things settle, he acted like it was business. But Lena heard the real message underneath. When trouble comes, the poor are always the first to be trimmed away. She nodded, thanked him, and swallowed the humiliation so neatly that it almost looked like grace. That afternoon, the assistant from the hotel called, her voice smooth, polite, and completely unconcerned with the fact that Lena's life was fraying. There was another request, the assistant said, another small responsibility, and she used the word opportunity, the way some people use the word mercy. Lena wanted to refuse on the spot, wanted to say she wasn't an errand, wasn't a pawn, wasn't a lesson someone rich could teach himself when he got bored. But then Noah coughed until his eyes watered, and the sound snapped her pride into a different shape. Pride could keep her upright, but it couldn't open a pharmacy drawer or stop a landlord's knock, and Lena hated that truth as much as she needed it. So she agreed to come back, not because she trusted them, but because she trusted her own ability to endure. And still, as she hung up, she felt something else stirring. Anger, not at the billionaire alone, but at a world where a mother had to negotiate for her child's breathing. When she returned to the Hawthorne, she was led into rooms that smelled like money and restraint, quiet hallways, art that looked expensive because it looked untouchable, doors that closed softly behind her like they were trained to keep secrets. She wasn't introduced as a person, she was introduced as a function, someone helping with a matter, someone assisting temporarily, someone whose presence could be explained away if it became inconvenient. In a glass-walled conference room, Lena caught the edges of conversations, lawyers speaking in soft, sharp phrases, executives smiling with their teeth but not their eyes, and a woman in emerald green who looked at Lena the way you look at a stain that might spread. The billionaire arrived late and said little, yet the room bent toward him like a field toward gravity, and Lena understood something she'd never fully seen before. Power doesn't shout when it knows it will be obeyed. She kept her chin up anyway, because pride was the only language she knew that didn't require permission. As the meeting moved on, Lena stepped out to refill a water pitcher, an excuse, a breath. And in the corridor, she heard voices through a half-closed door, muffled but clear enough to sting. Someone said her name with a soft laugh, called her the Waitress, and spoke about her like she was a disposable tool, useful for the moment, easy to blame later. Another voice answered colder, "If it breaks, it breaks. That's the point." And Lena's stomach turned because she recognized the shape of a plan forming around her. She backed away before they could open the door and find her listening, her pulse hammering, her pride suddenly feeling less like armor and more like a brittle thing that could crack if struck in the right place. By the time she returned to the room, her hands were steady again, but her heart carried a new, quiet certainty. She wasn't just being tested, she was being positioned, and she could feel the board tilting beneath her feet. By evening, the air around Lena felt different, tight, watchful, as if the building itself had learned her name and decided it didn't like the sound of it. The assistant's instructions had been simple again, almost harmless on paper. Walk a folder to a specific office, wait outside a conference room, do not speak unless spoken to. But the people in suits moved with a new sharpness, and smiles appeared and vanished like signals. Lena kept her posture steady, pride holding her spine in place, yet she could feel a trap being assembled with clean hands and quiet voices. Somewhere behind a door, someone laughed softly, and the sound made her skin prickle, not because it was loud, but because it was certain. When she passed a mirrored wall, she caught her own reflection, tired eyes, borrowed confidence, and for a brief second she looked like a stranger walking toward her own collapse. It happened fast, the way disasters always do when you can't afford them. 1 minute she was standing near the elevator with her hands folded. The next minute a security guard stepped in front of her and asked for her bag. The request was polite, almost apologetic, but there was steel behind it, and another guard appeared as if he'd been waiting just out of sight. An executive Lena had seen in the conference room, the woman in emerald green, stood a few steps away with her arms crossed, wearing sympathy like perfume. "It's just a formality," she said, and Lena heard the lie before she heard the words, because the room had already decided what it wanted to find. When the guard opened Lena's bag, the silence thickened, and a thin stack of documents appeared that Lena had never touched, papers stamped and signed in ink that looked too fresh to be real. Someone exhaled like a victory, and Lena's mouth went dry as she realized the story had been planted inside her life. The accusations arrived dressed as professionalism: misplaced funds, missing files, breach of trust, phrases that sounded clean until they landed on a mother with diner hands and no lawyer waiting outside. Lena tried to speak, but every sentence met the same wall. "We have evidence, we have procedure, we have witnesses," and the words wrapped around her like tape. When she insisted she hadn't done it, the Emerald Woman tilted her head, as if Lena were naive for believing truth mattered in a room like this. A man in a tailored suit mentioned authorities with the same casual tone someone might use to mention weather, and Lena felt a cold surge run through her chest, not fear for herself, but fear for Noah, because consequences don't fall neatly on the guilty. She reached for her phone, meaning to call the only person who could stop this, but the assistant's hand gently covered it. Soft touch, hard message. Not right now. When Lena finally made it back to the diner, she hoped the familiar smell of coffee and grease might steady her. Yet even there, the poison had arrived before she did. Her manager's face tightened the moment he saw her, and his voice dropped into that tone people use when they're trying to sound kind while pushing you out. "I can't have trouble here, Lena," he said, sliding her schedule across the counter with blank spaces where her shifts had been, as if her livelihood could be erased with a pen. A landlord's voicemail followed on her phone. Final notice, late fees, a threat that didn't need shouting, and then the pharmacy text landed like a punch. Refill denied, balance due. Lena stood behind the counter with her hands braced on the edge, breathing through the dizziness, because her pride could survive insults, but it could not survive a child running out of medicine. She tried calling the number she'd been given, once, twice, until the automated voice answered, calm and indifferent, disconnected. She didn't remember walking back to the booth where it had all started, only the way the Christmas lights blinked above her, like they had no idea they were mocking her. Noah's cough echoed in her mind, and Eli's warning burned again, "Be careful," as if the past had been watching her take the wrong step. Then she looked up, and the world tilted in a different direction. The grey-haired billionaire was sitting in her booth, hands folded, coat immaculate, face unreadable in the diner's cheap glow. He didn't wave her over or offer comfort. He simply watched her the way he had watched her that first night, as if the collapse was part of the lesson. Lena walked toward him slowly, every nerve screaming, and when she reached the table, he slid the original receipt across the surface, tip $0, like a reminder carved in ink. His voice was quiet when he finally spoke, but it landed like a lock turning. "Now," he said, "you understand what this costs." Lena didn't sit down. She couldn't, because if she let her knees bend, she feared she might not stand again. The billionaire's presence in that cracked vinyl booth felt unreal, like someone had dragged a boardroom ghost into a place that still smelled of bacon grease and burnt coffee. His calm made her want to scream, yet she heard her own voice come out quieter than she expected, steady, controlled, almost polite, because pride was the last thing she had left that no one could freeze, cut, or repossess. He watched her as if her panic were a clock he had started and intended to stop only when it suited him, and the diner's blinking lights reflected in his eyes like tiny, indifferent fires. Lena thought of the papers found in her bag, of the disconnected number, of the way her life had been rearranged in a single day, and she realized the cruelest part: he wasn't surprised by any of it. He spoke in careful sentences, not apologizing, not excusing, only describing the world the way powerful men like to describe it, as if it were a lesson instead of a wound. There were people around him, he said, who would do anything to protect control, people who could make a mother look like a thief and call it necessary. Lena felt her hands curl into fists under the edge of the counter, and she forced them open again, because she would not let him see her break in the place where she had spent years pretending she was unbreakable. "My child is sick," she said, and the words sounded like a vow more than a plea. The billionaire's gaze flickered, just once, toward the small backpack Lena carried, the one with Noah's spare sweater and the last cough drops she could afford, and for a moment his expression looked less like judgment and more like a man counting regrets. Then he slid something across the table, an address, a name, and a time, like a door offered to someone already falling. Lena left the diner without finishing the conversation because her son's breathing was the only voice she trusted more than her own. At home, the apartment greeted her with cold corners and familiar quiet, and she moved through it like someone walking through water, slow, heavy, careful not to spill the last of her strength. Noah was awake now, glassy-eyed and whimpering, and when she lifted him, he clung to her shirt as if he could feel the ground shifting under them. Lena rocked him near the window, whispering comfort into his damp hair, and the winter wind tapped the glass with thin, impatient fingers. She wanted to hate the billionaire with her whole heart, yet hate took energy, and energy belonged to Noah, not to rage. That night stretched wide and hollow, a long corridor of doubts Lena couldn't outrun. She prayed in the way people pray when they're out of options, no eloquence, no bargaining, just a trembling request for mercy and one more day. She thought of Eli's letter and how he'd warned her to be careful, and the memory stung because it felt like being protected too late. She replayed every step from the diner to the hotel, every signature, every envelope, and shame tried to creep in, soft as snow, relentless as winter, telling her she had been foolish to hope. But under the shame, a stubborn ember stayed alive. She did not steal, she did not lie, and she would not confess to a story someone else had written just to make rich people comfortable. The world could take her shifts, her sleep, her peace, but it would not take her truth without a fight. Near midnight, when Noah finally drifted into a fragile sleep against her shoulder, a sound came that didn't belong to the apartment's usual loneliness. A knock at the door, soft at first, then urgent, like someone trying not to wake the whole building. Lena froze, every muscle turning to wire, because danger had learned her address once already today. She didn't move right away. She listened, holding her breath, hearing only the old refrigerator hum and the faint wheeze of her child. The knock came again, careful but insistent, and a voice she couldn't place murmured her name through the wood. Quiet, rushed, almost pleading. Lena tightened her arms around Noah, stepped toward the door on silent feet, and in that thin gap between fear and faith, she understood that whatever waited on the other side would not be gentle. Lena opened the door only as wide as the chain allowed, her body angled to shield Noah, because even fear has instincts, and motherhood sharpens them into rules. In the dim hallway stood a young woman in a plain coat with wind-reddened cheeks and eyes that looked too honest to be brave, her hands lifted slightly, as if she didn't trust herself not to tremble. "Please," she whispered, voice cracking on the word like it hurt to say it. "I'm not here to hurt you. My name is Claire. I work for Mr. Hawthorne." The billionaire's name, Hawthorne, landed in Lena's chest with a cold familiarity, stitching the hotel to Eli's letter, stitching tonight to something older than her exhaustion. Claire glanced down at Noah's sleeping face, and something softened in her expression. Guilt, maybe, or the kind of compassion that comes from watching cruelty too close for too long. "They're setting you up," she said, and the sentence came out quick, urgent, as if it might be taken away if she didn't spend it immediately. Lena didn't let her in right away. She asked questions first, quiet and sharp, the way a woman learns to be when the world has taught her that kindness can be bait. Claire answered without drama. She named offices, described the conference room with the glass walls, repeated phrases Lena had already heard through that half-closed door, and each detail fit too perfectly to be invented. Then Claire reached into her bag and pulled out a folded stack of papers, photocopies marked with timestamps and signatures, and slid them carefully through the gap in the door like contraband. Lena unfolded them with one hand, while keeping Noah close with the other, and her eyes snagged on the circled lines, times that proved she couldn't have moved what they accused her of moving, access logs that showed another badge used her name like a costume. The relief that rose in her wasn't the sweet kind. It was sharp, almost painful, because it proved she wasn't crazy, but it also proved how easily they could have buried her. Lena looked up, and the hallway light caught the wet shine in Claire's eyes, as if the girl had been holding back tears for days. "They weren't supposed to go this far," Claire admitted, swallowing hard. Then she shook her head, as if correcting herself. "No. Someone was always going to go this far. It wasn't supposed to be you." The words tumbled out in fragments, pieces of a larger truth, factions inside the billionaire's world, people who smiled at charity dinners while quietly sharpening plans. Claire said Mr. Hawthorne had been ill for months, physically, yes, but also in the way grief sits behind a man's ribs and makes him do strange things with his power. He had wanted to find someone honest, someone who wouldn't bend for money, someone who could remind him what goodness looked like when it wasn't wearing a suit. But others had seen the test as an opportunity, something to hijack, something to turn into a weapon, and Lena's name had become a convenient target because she had no protection. Lena listened, heart pounding, because even hope felt dangerous now. Hope had sharp edges. Claire leaned closer, lowering her voice until it was almost a breath. "You can't trust the assistant, the one who brings you water," she said, and Lena felt a chill move through her because she could already picture that polished smile and empty eyes. "You can't trust the board. They want a scapegoat. And you can't trust the police report they'll file if you don't disappear quietly." Claire's hands clenched and unclenched, like she was trying to hold herself together by force. "But you can still change this," she added, and she pulled out a second slip of paper, smaller, handwritten, the ink rushed but firm. It held a time and a place, and beneath it one warning that made Lena's throat tighten. "If you go, don't let them separate you from the proof." Lena stared at the words and felt the room tilt, because the map to safety was being offered by someone inside the lion's mouth. Lena closed her eyes for half a second and thought of Noah's medicine bottle, thought of the landlord's voicemail, thought of the way shame had tried to crawl into her heart and make a home there. She opened them again and looked at Claire, seeing not a savior, but a person risking something, maybe her job, maybe her future, maybe her own safety, just to keep one stranger from being crushed. "Why are you doing this?" Lena asked softly, and Claire's mouth tightened like she was trying not to fall apart. "Because my mother was a waitress," Claire whispered, and the simplicity of it hit Lena harder than any speech ever could. Lena slid the chain free and opened the door fully, not because she trusted the billionaire's world, but because for the first time in hours, she trusted a human being. When Claire stepped inside, the apartment suddenly felt smaller, as if the truth took up more space than lies ever did. Lena set the papers on the table under the lamp, smoothing them with careful hands, and the evidence looked almost ordinary, just ink, just dates. Yet it carried the power to keep her child's life from being swallowed by someone else's scheme. Claire pointed to a line on the page and explained what it meant, then gave Lena the final detail. A private entrance, a short window of time before the board meeting, a chance to put the proof directly into Mr. Hawthorne's hands. Lena listened, and her fear didn't vanish. It simply rearranged itself into something sharper, something usable. Because now she understood the worst truth of all. Mr. Hawthorne might not be her enemy, but he might not be in control. And if Lena wanted justice, she would have to walk back into the storm while it still remembered her name. Lena arrived at the Hawthorne before dawn, the city still half asleep and the air sharp enough to sting, yet her steps were steadier than they had been in days. Claire walked beside her, not like a guide who promised safety, but like a witness who refused to let Lena be swallowed quietly. The service entrance swallowed them into warm, polished silence, and Lena felt the old intimidation rise, then settle, because fear was no longer the loudest thing in her chest. In her bag, the photocopies lay flat and firm, the kind of truth that doesn't shine, but doesn't bend either. She didn't belong in this place, and that was exactly why she had to be here. The corridor smelled of citrus cleaner and expensive calm, and the staff moved with rehearsed softness, as if footsteps were another kind of etiquette. Lena noticed staged holiday warmth everywhere, wreaths placed at perfect angles, a sparkling tree positioned where cameras would love it, yet behind the decorations, the building felt like a courtroom waiting to open. Claire led her to a small side door, and they slipped into a quiet lounge, where a security guard glanced up, then down again, pretending not to see them. Lena's heart thudded once, hard, when she spotted the assistant in the fitted black suit across the hall, smiling, watching, already calculating. She kept her gaze forward, because dignity is sometimes just refusing to flinch in the presence of a predator. Then a second door opened, and the air changed, like the room itself recognized gravity entering. Mr. Hawthorne stood there without entourage, coat off, sleeves rolled just enough to suggest fatigue rather than warmth, his face composed, but his eyes carrying the dull shadow of a man who hasn't slept. He looked at Lena, not as a waitress this time, not as a rumor, not as a disposable tool. He looked as if he finally understood she had been forced to grow teeth. Lena didn't waste words. She placed the papers on the table between them and slid them forward with both hands, steady as a vow. "I didn't take anything," she said, and her voice held the quiet firmness of a mother counting breaths in the dark. Hawthorne scanned the timestamps, the access logs, the mismatched signatures, and something tightened in his jaw. Anger, yes, but also shame, because the trap had been built in his house with his name as the roof. When he looked up again, the cold certainty he'd worn in the diner had cracked into something more human and more dangerous. He didn't apologize right away. Men like him often don't know how. Yet his silence changed shape, turning from control into reckoning. This went further than intended, he admitted, and Lena felt the words scrape, because intention doesn't heal harm, and tests don't comfort sick children. Still, she watched him closely and saw the truth Claire had hinted at. Hawthorne was powerful, but power doesn't always mean freedom. Sometimes it means being surrounded by people who smile while they sharpen the rules. "They wanted a scapegoat," Lena said, and the billionaire's eyes narrowed, as if the word had cut through every polite lie in the building. He asked one question then, not about money or loyalty, but about Noah. How old, how sick, how long, like a man forcing himself to see the cost of the game he'd started. Lena answered without softening it, because she refused to decorate pain for anyone, not even a billionaire. When Hawthorne finally spoke again, his voice was quieter, less like a judge, more like a man deciding whether he would keep living behind glass. "They'll try to break you in public," he said, meaning the board, meaning the family, meaning the polished room where reputations were crushed as neatly as paper. Lena felt the fear rise, but it didn't own her the way it once did, because now she had proof, and she had learned that silence can be a cage if you stay inside it. "Then I won't be alone," she replied, glancing once at Claire, and Hawthorne's gaze flickered, recognizing betrayal, recognizing conscience, recognizing the cost of both. He reached into the drawer and pulled out a slim badge, temporary clearance, a pass into the room where decisions were made, and set it down like an invitation that could also become a weapon. Lena stared at it for a beat, feeling the weight of every risk she was about to take, and when she finally picked it up, she understood one hard truth. Justice was waiting upstairs, and it would not be gentle. The badge felt cold in Lena's fingers as she followed Hawthorne through a quieter wing of the hotel, past framed photographs of gala nights and ribbon cuttings that looked like proof of goodness. Proof that could be staged, sold, and edited. He didn't walk fast, but he walked with certainty, and the staff parted for him the way water parts for a stone, eyes lowered, mouths sealed. Lena kept her chin up, yet she could feel the building listening, because in places like this, walls don't just hold secrets, they keep score. Claire stayed a step behind, silent and tense, and Lena understood that loyalty here wasn't a feeling, it was a risk calculation with human faces. They entered a private study lined with books no one touched, and a Christmas arrangement placed like a final touch for anyone watching. And Hawthorne opened a drawer, as if he'd already decided what truth he could no longer hide. He slid out a file, thin, clean and far heavier than it looked, then placed it in front of Lena with a slow, careful motion that felt almost respectful. "This is what they were really protecting," he said, and Lena's eyes moved across the first page, names, account numbers, legal language, and one phrase that made her stomach tighten: philanthropic trust. It wasn't just money, it was power disguised as charity, a structure that could shift control away from the board if the right clause was activated, and suddenly Lena understood why they needed a scapegoat, because panic makes dangerous people reckless. Hawthorne's voice lowered, rougher at the edges now, as if speaking truth cost him more than silence ever had. The missing documents, he explained, weren't about theft. They were about succession, about who would hold the keys when he no longer could, and how the public would react when the name on the trust wasn't one of the polished heirs the board had been grooming. Lena listened and felt the room tighten around her because she could hear the strategy hiding under the words. If they framed her, they could bury the trust, bury the clause, and bury any future that didn't belong to them. "Why me?" she asked, and Hawthorne didn't answer immediately, his gaze drifting to a spot on the table like he was staring at an old regret. Then he said, almost reluctantly, "Because you were the cleanest mirror I could find." When Lena pressed, because she couldn't afford poetry, he finally admitted something that made her breath catch. The $0 tip hadn't been a simple cruelty. It had been a signal, a code used inside his own circle, an ugly method born from paranoia, marking someone as a subject of observation, a person he wanted watched without being warned. "It told them to pay attention to you," he said, and the words landed like a second humiliation, sharper than the first, because it meant her pain had been shared like a memo. Claire flinched behind her, and Lena felt anger rise hot in her throat. Anger at the billionaire, at the system, at herself for walking into a net, yet beneath the anger was something worse, the realization that Hawthorne had never been the only one deciding her fate. Then Hawthorne turned one page deeper into the file, and Lena's world shifted in a way that didn't feel like fear. It felt like destiny snapping into place. An old photograph was clipped inside, slightly yellowed, taken at some formal event years ago, and there, near the edge, was a younger Hawthorne beside a man Lena recognized instantly, even before her mind could accept it. Eli. Her late husband, smiling politely, standing in a room he never mentioned, connected to a life he never explained, captured in a moment that made every "we'll be okay" suddenly echo with a hidden meaning. Lena's fingers tightened around the paper until it trembled, her heart pounding as the last unbearable truth rose to the surface. Hawthorne hadn't chosen her at random in that diner because he'd known her name long before Christmas Eve, and whatever Eli had been protecting her from had finally come to collect its debt. Lena walked into the boardroom with Eli's face still burning behind her eyes, as if the photograph had stamped itself on the inside of her skull. The room was all polished wood and controlled breathing. Leather chairs, frosted glass, a Christmas centerpiece placed like a prop to soften the cruelty that lived there year-round. Executives sat in neat rows with expressions that practiced sympathy the way people practice speech, just enough warmth to look human, never enough to be held accountable. Claire stayed near the doorway, tense and pale, while Hawthorne took his seat at the head of the table without announcing himself, letting the room feel his presence before he spoke a word. Lena held the folder of evidence against her ribs like armor, and she reminded herself, "Noah needs you steady, not perfect." The woman in emerald green began first, voice smooth as satin, eyes bright with the kind of confidence that comes from believing consequences for other people. She spoke of protocol and breach and unfortunate misunderstandings, then placed Lena's name into the conversation as if it were a stain the room wanted removed. Papers were slid across the table. Clean copies, forged signatures, a timeline arranged like a trap that looked logical if you didn't know where to look. Lena listened without interrupting, because she had learned at the diner that letting someone finish their cruelty often reveals its seams. When the Emerald Woman finally paused, she gave Lena a practiced, almost pitying smile, like a hostess offering a guest a graceful way to confess. "We can handle this quietly," she said, and the kindness in the sentence was the sharpest part of it. Lena set her evidence on the table and slid it forward, not with trembling hands, but with the calm of someone who has already been through the worst kind of night. "Quietly is how you bury people," she said, her voice low, steady, and suddenly the room felt colder because truth has a way of changing the temperature. She pointed to the access logs, the timestamps, the badge records, small, boring details that become powerful when they refuse to lie, and the first crack appeared in the board's certainty. A man with silver glasses cleared his throat too quickly, as if he'd swallowed a surprise, and another executive avoided looking at the documents at all, choosing instead to stare at Lena like she was the problem for bringing reality into their polished world. Hawthorne watched without expression, but Lena could feel his attention like a weight. He was letting the room reveal itself, letting them show how far they would go when challenged. The Emerald Woman didn't lose her composure. She sharpened it, tilting her head as if Lena's proof were interesting but irrelevant. "You're a single mother," she said gently, and the way she said it turned motherhood into a weakness, a flaw to exploit. "You're under financial pressure. People do desperate things." Lena felt anger flare, hot and dangerous, but she held it behind her teeth, because she refused to let them turn her into the stereotype they needed. "Desperation doesn't make me a thief," Lena answered, and she kept her gaze steady, letting her words land without begging. Then the Emerald Woman made her final move, the one meant to end the conversation in bloodless silence. She suggested child services, suggested concern, suggested that a mother involved in financial misconduct might not be a safe environment. The threat was soft, almost polite, and it hit Lena like a fist because it didn't target her pride. It targeted Noah. For one breath, the room seemed to lean forward, waiting to see if Lena would crumble, and Lena felt her knees threaten to betray her. Then she pictured Noah's sleeping face, his small fingers clutching her shirt, and something inside her locked into place. She didn't shout. She didn't plead. She simply turned her eyes toward Hawthorne and spoke the truth like a line drawn in the sand. "If you let them use my child as a weapon," she said quietly, "then your test proved nothing, except that power here is still cruel." The words hung in the air, and the boardroom's polished calm began to look like paint starting to crack. Hawthorne's jaw tightened, his gaze shifting from Lena's face to the Emerald Woman, and the silence that followed wasn't empty. It was decision-forming. And in that heavy hush, Lena realized the confrontation wasn't only about whether she would be believed. It was about whether the billionaire would finally choose to be human, where it actually cost him something. Hawthorne didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to, because when he finally moved, the room moved with him, like a tide answering the moon. He stood slowly, palms resting on the polished table, and for a moment his silence felt different than it had in the diner, less like control, more like restraint being released. "Enough," he said, and the single word landed with a weight that made the Emerald Woman's smile tighten at the corners. Hawthorne reached for the folder Lena had brought and opened it himself, not delegating the truth to anyone else. And as he read aloud the timestamps and access logs, the board's neat certainty began to wobble. He didn't accuse in a dramatic flourish. He simply revealed line by line how the story had been manufactured, how Lena's name had been used like a mask, how the evidence pointed away from her with the stubborn clarity of facts that refused to be bought. In that moment, Lena saw something she hadn't expected to see in him: disgust, not for her, but for the machine he had allowed to grow under his roof. The Emerald Woman tried to recover with elegance. She spoke of misunderstandings, of protecting the company, of optics and liabilities, yet each word sounded thinner now, because Hawthorne's attention had shifted from her performance to her intent. He slid a second file onto the table, one the board hadn't seen, and the air changed, because people who live by secrets recognize the smell of exposure. "You moved the documents," Hawthorne said, his voice calm but sharpened, "and you planted the copies." Then he named names: security personnel, an assistant, a legal consultant, placing their roles into the light with the precision of someone who had finally decided not to look away. A man with silver glasses went pale. Another executive stared at the table as if it might open and swallow him, and the Emerald Woman's hands curled around her pen a fraction too tightly, the first honest sign of panic. Hawthorne wasn't punishing them for personal betrayal. He was stripping them of the illusion that they could harm people and call it procedure. When the threat against Noah came up again, Hawthorne's composure went colder than winter, and Lena felt a strange relief, because cold, when directed at the right target, can be protective. "Do not speak about her child as leverage," he said, and the room seemed to shrink around the sentence. He turned to Lena then, and the way he looked at her was different, like he was finally seeing the cost in her eyes, not just the outcome in his. "You were never supposed to be destroyed," he admitted, and the admission was imperfect, too late, and still somehow necessary. Lena wanted to throw it back at him, because tests still leave bruises even when they end. Yet she also saw the truth behind it. He had started a fire to find warmth, and other hands had tried to burn her alive. Hawthorne's gaze shifted to Claire at the door, and he gave the smallest nod, recognition of courage, of conscience, of someone refusing to be complicit. The board's collapse didn't come with shouting. It came with paperwork, phone calls, resignations drafted in trembling hands, and security quietly escorting certain people out through back corridors so the holiday decorations wouldn't have to witness it. Hawthorne ordered an immediate review, a formal investigation, legal action, justice that sounded clinical, but Lena felt its moral weight in her lungs like air returning. Then, in a move that startled the room into a deeper silence, he placed the original diner receipt on the table beside Lena's evidence. The tip, $0, now looking less like a verdict and more like a confession. "I did that," he said plainly, and the board stiffened, because billionaires don't usually admit fault in rooms designed to protect them. And it was wrong. The words weren't polished, and maybe that was why they mattered, because for the first time he wasn't hiding behind strategy. After the meeting, Hawthorne asked Lena to stay for a moment, and the hallway outside the boardroom felt too bright, too clean, like truth had scrubbed the air raw. He didn't offer her a glamorous promise. He offered something steadier. Medical care for Noah, immediate, no conditions, and legal protection for Lena's name, so she could walk into her diner without whispers tearing at her back. Lena listened, careful, because trust doesn't grow in a single conversation, especially not in a place like this. "I'm not your project," she said, the words quiet but firm, and Hawthorne's eyes held, not offended, almost grateful, as if he needed someone to speak to him that way. "No," he answered, voice low. "You're the proof I've been missing." Then he offered her a role, public, visible, tied to the trust and its mission, something that could change her life and also paint a target on her back. Lena felt the weight of it settle on her shoulders, and she understood the turn wasn't only justice, it was recognition, the kind that opens a door and dares you to walk through it. The first thing Lena felt when the help actually arrived was not joy, it was disbelief, the kind that makes a person flinch at kindness because it feels unfamiliar. Hawthorne's private driver brought her to a clinic that didn't smell like panic and waiting rooms, and when the nurse took Noah's temperature and spoke gently, Lena's shoulders finally dropped a fraction, as if her body had been holding itself up on pure fear for months. The doctor didn't ask questions that sounded like judgment. He asked questions that sounded like care. And when he handed Lena the prescription and said, "We'll handle it," she had to blink hard, because tears came too fast. Noah's medicine was filled immediately, the bottle warm in her hand like proof that miracles can arrive wearing ordinary labels. In the car ride home, Noah slept deeper than he had in days, and Lena watched his chest rise and fall with a quiet gratitude that felt almost like pain leaving. Back at the apartment, she paid what she could and arranged what she couldn't. Rent stabilized, fees negotiated, the immediate cliff of eviction pulled back just enough to breathe. Hawthorne's legal team called with concise, respectful updates, records corrected, accusations withdrawn, statements prepared. Yet they spoke to her like a person, not a problem, and that alone felt like a kind of healing. At the diner, her manager avoided her eyes at first, then finally muttered an apology that sounded embarrassed and sincere in equal measure. "I didn't know," he said, and Lena almost laughed because that was the point. People never know the full story of the struggling, they just assume the worst because it's easier than empathy. She took her shifts back without gloating, because pride had already cost her too much energy, and she wasn't interested in revenge that tasted like bitterness. When the Christmas lights blinked above the booths, they didn't feel like mockery anymore. They felt like stubborn little witnesses to survival. Hawthorne didn't turn her life into a press release. He surprised her by keeping the most meaningful changes private. He visited once without cameras, standing awkwardly in her small living room beside the paper tree Noah had colored, looking like a man who had never learned how to enter a humble place without feeling he might break it. He didn't offer a grand speech. He asked about Noah's appetite, about sleep, about what the cough sounded like at night. And Lena realized he was forcing himself to look directly at the cost of his choices. When he spoke about building a clinic fund instead of hosting another gala, his voice carried something new. Less pride, more purpose, as if he'd grown tired of shining his goodness and wanted it to actually work. Lena didn't forgive him quickly. She forgave him carefully, the way you mend a cracked cup, because trust can hold warmth again, but only if you respect where it broke. And in those quiet moments, she felt a strange peace begin to spread through her, small, steady, and real. But healing has a cruel habit. It makes you lower your guard just enough for old threats to find the soft parts again. One evening, after Noah had fallen asleep with a calmer breath and Lena had finally allowed herself to sit without trembling, her phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. There was no greeting, no politeness, only a photo attachment and one sentence. "Tell your billionaire to stop playing hero, or everyone will learn what your husband really did." Lena's fingers went numb as the image loaded. Eli's face, captured in a way she'd never seen, standing beside a man in a suit she didn't recognize, his expression tense, his hand mid-reach as if taking or giving something. The date stamp in the corner made her stomach drop, because it was from months before his death, months he'd told her were ordinary. Lena stared until her eyes burned, feeling the ground of her new peace begin to tremble. She didn't wake Noah. She couldn't bring that darkness into his room, so she stood by the kitchen window alone, the glass reflecting her face like a question she wasn't ready to answer. The message wasn't only a threat, it was a leash, meant to pull her back into silence by poisoning the memory of the man she had loved. Lena realized then that the boardroom victory hadn't ended the war. It had only changed the battlefield, turning it from legal accusations into something more personal, more cruel. She could walk away now, stay quiet, keep her child safe, and let the powerful bury the rest. She could choose peace that required surrender, or she could step into the light with the truth, risk being judged, risk being torn apart by strangers who love simple stories, and still refuse to let fear write the ending. Lena folded her hands against the cold glass and felt her heart settle into a hard, steady beat, because she understood what the next fight would demand. And somewhere in the dark, beyond the blinking Christmas lights, the last weapon had been raised, waiting to see whether she would protect her comfort or protect the truth. Lena didn't answer the unknown number. She learned long ago that fear feeds on quick replies. Yet she didn't ignore it either, because ignoring a threat is just another way of pretending it isn't real. She saved the photo, printed it at a little shop near the diner before her shift, and studied it in the harsh fluorescent light, where nothing looks flattering and everything looks honest. Eli's hand was reaching toward a folder, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on something just out of frame. He looked less like a man committing a crime and more like a man trying to stop one. Lena felt grief rise like a wave she'd been holding back for years, because the message wasn't only blackmail, it was an attempt to rewrite her love into shame. She tucked the printout into an envelope and walked into the day with her heart steadying itself around a new decision. If someone wanted to use Eli's name as a weapon, she would stop letting his silence be the only story. She met Hawthorne in a small chapel-like room inside the clinic he'd funded, quiet benches, a single candle, and the kind of calm that makes truth feel safer to say. Claire was there too, standing near the door, hands clasped, eyes tired from carrying conscience in a place that punished it. Lena placed the photo on the table between them, and Hawthorne's face tightened in a way that wasn't anger at Lena. It was recognition of a strategy he knew too well. "They're not trying to destroy you," he said softly. "They're trying to make you disappear without a fight." Lena nodded, because the message had felt exactly like that. An invitation back into the old role of the invisible woman who stays quiet to keep her child safe. Hawthorne looked at Eli's face for a long moment, then exhaled like a man remembering a wound he'd never allowed himself to name. "Eli wasn't taking," he said at last. "He was delivering something to me, something he thought would protect you if anything happened." The truth came in pieces, gentle and heavy at the same time. Eli had worked briefly in a security-adjacent role years ago, contracted through a third party, and he had stumbled upon financial movements inside Hawthorne's organization that didn't match the public image. He had gathered what he could, quietly, and when he realized the wrong people were watching him, he tried to step away. Yet stepping away from powerful people can look like betrayal, even when it's just survival. Hawthorne admitted his greatest failure without dressing it up. He had known someone was pressuring Eli, but he had underestimated how far they'd go, and when Eli died, Hawthorne's grief curdled into suspicion. That suspicion became the tests, the cold habits, the belief that he needed to provoke truth out of people instead of protecting it. Lena listened and felt a strange clarity settle over her. Eli hadn't kept secrets because he didn't love her. He'd kept them because he loved her enough to try to hold danger away with his own hands. And suddenly her husband's last warning, "Be careful," no longer felt like fear. It felt like care. The next step wasn't dramatic, no shouting into cameras, no revenge speech, just a decision to tell the truth with grace before lies could spread it like poison. Hawthorne's legal team prepared a statement that didn't turn Lena into a saint or Eli into a legend. It simply laid out the facts, corrected the accusations, and made it clear that a mother had been targeted to protect a corrupt grip on power. Lena agreed to speak publicly once, briefly, with Hawthorne beside her, not as her savior, but as a man willing to take responsibility in the only way that mattered, in front of witnesses. When she spoke, she didn't beg for sympathy. She spoke about dignity, about how easy it is to crush small people, and about how kindness should never be tested like a game from a throne. Her voice didn't tremble when she mentioned Eli, not because grief was gone, but because she had finally given it a clean place to stand. And as she finished, the room didn't erupt into applause. It fell into a hush that felt like people remembering their own humanity. In the weeks that followed, redemption took the shape of real things: medical bills paid without hidden hooks, a family clinic fund built for single parents, scholarships for service workers who had been told their dreams were too expensive, and a quiet holiday program that filled pantries without asking people to perform gratitude. Hawthorne didn't plaster his name on every gift. Sometimes he left it off entirely, and Lena noticed that was when his help felt most sincere. Claire kept her job, not because the world is always kind, but because truth, when protected, can sometimes carve a path where none existed. Lena kept her diner shifts too, at least part-time, because she didn't want her life to be defined only by trauma or rescue. She wanted it defined by choice, and when she looked in the mirror now, she didn't see a woman who had been chosen by a billionaire. She saw a woman who had chosen herself when it mattered most. On Christmas morning, the apartment was still small, the tree still modest, but the air felt different, lighter, warmer, less afraid. Noah woke up with clear eyes and a laugh that sounded like a future, and Lena held him close, breathing in the miracle of a simple day that wasn't ruled by panic. Later, she stopped by the diner with a tin of cookies, and the same blinking lights greeted her. Only this time, they didn't feel like mockery. They felt like proof that even tired things can keep shining. Lena understood then what the night of the $0 tip had really been, not a verdict but a doorway, and what she had carried through it was something no fortune could measure: dignity that refused to shrink. If this story touched your heart, leave a heart in the comments and subscribe for more stories about kindness and redemption.